A stormy night. A vanished heirloom. Secrets buried in every shadow. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make this journey extraordinary. Let's begin. The summer afternoon was one of those perfectly English days that seemed painted rather than lived. Sunlight filtering through lime trees, a soft hum of bees over the rose borders, and the faint clinking of teacups beneath the great striped marquee. The annual garden fete at Maplewood Manor was in full swing, and St. Mary Mead's best hats had gathered to witness the crowning of the village flower queen. Lady Beatrice Fenton, the owner of Maplewood Manor, stood near the refreshment table, graciously overseeing the proceedings with her usual air of imperious charm. Her silvery hair caught the sun, and her pearls gleamed as she nodded politely to each villager who approached. To most she was the very model of Old English gentility, generous in public, formidable in private. Near the edge of the lawn, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly beneath a linden tree, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. To anyone else, she appeared absorbed in the intricate pattern of her lace shawl, but her blue eyes, sharp, knowing, and endlessly observant, flicked now and then to the little dramas unfolding among the guests. She noticed, for instance, that young Michael Denham, the village solicitor's assistant, was watching Lady Beatrice's niece, Miss Clara Fenton, with an intensity quite unsuited to a simple garden fete. Clara, for her part, seemed rather flustered, avoiding his gaze and dropping her parasol twice in as many minutes. Miss Marple tucked that away for later reflection. Young people and their hearts were curious things. Such a lovely day for it, isn't it, Miss Marple? Chirped Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who appeared beside her carrying a plate of sponge cake. Yes, indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes on Lady Beatrice. One might almost forget that real tempests often brew beneath blue skies. Dolly laughed, taking the remark for one of Miss Marple's harmless aphorisms, as did everyone until much later, when they would remember her words with a shiver. At precisely 3 o'clock the fete's cheerful rhythm faltered. A sharp cry rang out from the direction of the manor's orangery, the sort of cry that silences birds and freezes laughter mid-air. Heads turned, fans stopped fluttering, and then the murmur began. It was Miss Clara Fenton who emerged from the glass house, pale as the lace on her gown, hands trembling. "It's Aunt Beatrice," she gasped. "Something's happened, yet she's not moving." The crowd surged forward, curiosity and alarm intertwining. Miss Marple rose, knitting forgotten, and made her way not quickly, but with the steady purpose of one who knows that tragedy rarely benefits from haste. Inside the orangery, Lady Beatrice Fenton lay sprawled upon the tiled floor amid shattered glass and scattered blossoms. The air was thick with the cloying scent of orchids and something else, faint, acrid, unfamiliar. Her teacup lay beside her, overturned, a thin trail of liquid seeping toward the drain. Dr. Hayward, the village physician, knelt beside her, his brow furrowed. "She's gone," he said at last, glancing grimly at the others. "Sudden collapse, perhaps, though—" He sniffed the air, then frowned deeper. "I'll need to examine further." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the doorway, tilted her head. Her gaze lingered on the cup, then on the faint discoloration along its rim. A subtle greenish tint one might miss entirely, unless one had once seen it before. But she said nothing. Not yet. Outside, the fete continued in hushed confusion. The bunting fluttered, the gramophone wound down, and whispers began to spread faster than the summer breeze. By evening, all of St. Mary Mead would know that Lady Beatrice Fenton of Maplewood Manor had died, and quite suddenly, quite inexplicably, was at her own garden party. And by morning, the village would already be arguing about who had done it. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, The Village Reacts, where gossip and suspicion begin to weave their intricate web around Maplewood Manor? The morning after the fete dawned pale and subdued over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself felt the weight of what had happened. A thin mist lay over the meadows beyond the churchyard, softening the edges of hedgerows and chimneys. The usual chatter of birds was muted, and the postman's whistle, typically a cheery herald of gossip, sounded oddly hesitant as he made his rounds. Everyone knew by now, Lady Beatrice Fenton of Maplewood Manor was dead. The newspapers would likely call it a tragic sudden illness, but no one in the village believed it for a moment. St. Mary Mead had a way of sniffing out unpleasant truths, and this was no different. At breakfast, Miss Marple sat quietly at her small oak table, the teapot steaming gently before her, the Times folded beside a dish of marmalade. She stirred her tea twice, once clockwise, once counter, then laid the spoon carefully on its saucer. She had slept little. There had been too many small untidy details lingering in her mind. The cup with that curious residue, the faint chemical tang in the air, Clara Fenton's terrified expression. It was all quite wrong for a natural collapse. But Miss Marple, ever cautious, believed in waiting for facts to surface naturally. People, she always said, revealed the truth of themselves in due course, if only one allowed them to talk enough. By 9:30, the entire village had already begun to talk. At the post office, Mrs. Perkins leaned halfway across the counter to whisper that she'd heard Lady Beatrice had argued with her niece just the day before the fete. Something about the will, she confided in tones of solemn relish. It's always about wills in these sorts of cases, isn't it? At the bakery, old Mr. Cottle, who hadn't missed a fete in 30 years, swore that he'd seen Lady Beatrice slip something into her own teacup, a tonic, he thought, just before she took that final sip. Poisoned herself, more like, muttered another. Accidental, of course, and at the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley declared with relish that it was surely the work of envy or revenge, though who exactly had the nerve for it she couldn't possibly say. The village hummed with speculation, each retelling more confident than the last, until it became impossible to separate truth from embroidery. Miss Marple listened to all of it without comment, merely nodding, her knitting needles clicking steadily in her lap. It was a sort of music to her, the rhythm of village speech, the rise and fall of rumour. Each note told her something different. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester, a large square man with a moustache that bristled when he was irritated, which was often. He was not the sort of person inclined toward subtleties. He made his way to Maplewood Manor, with the purposeful gait of one determined to find a straightforward solution, whether or not one existed. Miss Marple, walking in the same direction under pretext of calling on poor Clara Fenton to offer condolences, met him at the gates. "Ah, Miss Marple," said Cray, touching his hat. "Terrible business, this. Heart failure, the doctor says, but I'm not so sure. These things often turn out to be something nastier. I understand you were present?" "I was nearby, yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Poor Lady Beatrice. She seemed quite well not half an hour before. Such a pity. Though," she added, as if in idle thought, "I dare say you've already considered that her death came immediately after tea." Cray gave a short laugh. Yes, tea and murder. You've a reputation, Miss Marple, for seeing the devil behind every teacup." She smiled mildly. "I find the devil is often rather fond of them." Inside Maplewood Manor, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, a plump woman with perpetually anxious eyes, showed them into the drawing-room where Clara sat, pale and hollow-eyed, clutching a handkerchief. Her grief seemed genuine, though there was a tremor about her that suggested more than sorrow, something like fear. "I can't understand it," Clara murmured as Cray questioned her. "Aunt Beatrice was perfectly well yesterday morning. She said she felt a little faint after luncheon, but nothing serious. She insisted the fete go on." "Oh, Inspector, surely this must be a dreadful accident." Cray's eyes narrowed. "You were the one who found her?" "Yes." Clara's fingers twisted the handkerchief. "I'd gone to fetch her parasol from the orangery. When I came in, she was lying there. I thought she'd fainted. But when I touched her hand, oh, it was cold already." Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the trembling voice, the flush that rose quickly and faded. Guilt or horror? She couldn't yet tell. But when the inspector asked about who had served Lady Beatrice her tea, Clara faltered. It was Mrs. Finch, I believe," she said. "Or perhaps I poured it myself, I don't quite remember." Mrs. Finch wrung her hands. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I poured for everyone at the table. Hers the same as the rest, the same," Miss Marple repeated softly. "And yet hers had that odd greenish stain, did it not?" All eyes turned to her. Clara looked startled. "You saw that?" "Just a trace," said Miss Marple, knitting expression returning. "But I couldn't help noticing. Greenish like, something from the garden, perhaps. A tonic, as Mr. Cottle said, or maybe a drop of some herbal infusion." Cray frowned. "Dr. Hayward said something about traces of digitalis in her system. Heart medicine, he called it. Could be she took too much by mistake." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "That is often the explanation with such cases, only—" She hesitated, letting the silence stretch. "Only Lady Beatrice was known to be extremely cautious about her health. I doubt she'd ever take more than her prescribed dose. And then, of course, there's the matter of that faintly sweet smell in the orangery. Almonds, was it?" Cray's brows shot up. "Almonds? Perhaps I imagined it," Miss Marple said almost apologetically. "My sense of smell has always been rather keen. Still, it may be worth mentioning." When she and Cray emerged from the manor an hour later, the inspector was frowning more deeply than before. "Cyanide, perhaps," he muttered. "But how and why? No signs of struggle, no enemies that I can see." Miss Marple glanced toward the garden, where the remnants of yesterday's fate still littered the grass. Fallen bunting, a forgotten hat, and the silver tea service gleaming innocently in the sunlight. "Enemies," she said quietly, "are seldom where one expects to find them. Sometimes they come smiling, bearing cake and conversation." As the day wore on, the rumors grew darker. It was said that Lady Beatrice had recently changed her will, cutting out a certain beneficiary in favor of her niece. It was also whispered that her late husband's investments had failed years ago, and that she'd been living on dwindling means, though she maintained appearances. The Fenton name, after all, carried weight in St. Mary Mead, and appearances mattered more than truth. By evening, Miss Marple found herself taking tea with her old friend Dolly Bantry, who was all aflutter with speculation. "Mark my words, Jane, it's that nephew of hers, what's his name? Henry. He's been after her estate for years. You remember that dreadful business with the hunting lodge? Money trouble, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Yes, Henry Fenton, though I don't recall seeing him at the fete yesterday. He wasn't there. Arrived this morning, bold as brass, demanding to see the inspector. Can you imagine? If that doesn't reek of guilt, I don't know what does." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "or perhaps he only came because he expected precisely that reaction." She smiled faintly. "Human nature, Dolly. It's always the same play, merely with different actors," Dolly huffed. "You and your human nature. I prefer plain motives, money, jealousy, revenge. All this psychology makes my head spin." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, but those are precisely the forms that human nature takes, my dear. Still, I agree. There's something distinctly unpleasant beneath all this." Lady Beatrice was a woman of strong opinions and stronger resentments. One only hopes she didn't take them with her. That night, as the church clock struck 10, Miss Marple sat by her window, the curtains half drawn against the mist rising over the common. Below, the village lay still. Somewhere a dog barked once, twice, and then was silent. She thought again of Lady Beatrice's last moments, the tremor of the hand that held the cup, the curious film on its rim, the faint scent that lingered. Death by misadventure? Hardly. She set down her knitting and gazed toward the faint outline of Maplewood Manor in the distance, The village, she knew, would not rest until someone was blamed. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that guilt was rarely a matter of who looked the part. It was hidden, like weeds beneath a well-tended rosebush, just waiting for the right gardener to lift the soil and expose it to the light. And she, more than anyone, knew precisely how to dig. The following morning, the sky hung low and grey over St. Mary Mead, pressing its damp breath upon the hedgerows and cobbled lanes. A drizzle had begun by the time Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, fastening the top button of her cardigan with careful precision. She carried her small wicker basket, for though death had visited the village, life insisted on going on. One still needed milk, bread, and a bit of gossip to keep the mind sharp. And gossip, Miss Marple reflected, was in no short supply today. At the grocer's, Mrs. Perkins was already mid-conversation with a group of women gathered around the scales. "I tell you," she said in a tone that implied undisputed authority, "it was digitalis that did it. My cousin's husband was once a chemist, and he said it takes only a pinch, more than the prescribed dose to stop the heart in seconds. Then she poisoned herself," said one woman with an air of tragic satisfaction. "Or was poisoned," whispered another. "They say her will's been changed, don't they?" Miss Marple's arrival was met with polite smiles, but the tone of the gathering shifted. She was a quiet woman, but her presence had a way of cooling careless tongues. "Good morning," she said mildly, selecting a loaf of brown bread. "I see we are all taking a great interest in Lady Beatrice's passing. A sad business, truly. Though perhaps," she added gently, "it's wiser not to judge too soon. Death has a way of being more complicated than appearances suggest." She paid for her purchases, tucked the bread under her arm, and made her way home, rain tapping lightly against her umbrella. Halfway down the lane she met Dr. Hayward, his coat collar turned up, his brow furrowed in thought. "Good morning, Doctor," she greeted. "A most unfortunate affair, I fear," he sighed. "Indeed, Miss Marple. I've just come from the inspector. The post-mortem confirms cyanide. Enough to fell an ox. But how it got into her system, well, that's the mystery." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, cyanide. Then my nose wasn't mistaken after all. Such a distinctive scent, isn't it? Bitter almonds, quite right. Though it's odd, there was none in the tea left in the pot, nor in the sugar, nor the milk. And her teacup, unfortunately, had been rinsed before we arrived." "Rinsed?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Apparently by Mrs. Finch," said Hayward. "She claims she did it without thinking, poor woman. Habit, she says. But it complicates things. The inspector's furious." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Habit can be a most dangerous thing. It reveals so much of a person's true nature." They parted ways at the gate to her cottage, the doctor continuing down the lane toward the manor. Miss Marple paused on her doorstep, her mind quietly sorting through the new piece of information. Mrs. Finch rinsing the cup might be innocent. Many housekeepers acted on routine, but in a murder, the smallest instinct could have meaning. By noon the rain had stopped, and the sun broke through, glinting faintly off the wet cobbles. Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Clara Fenton. She arrived at Maplewood Manor, bearing a small basket of currant scones, a kindness wrapped in purpose. Clara, still pale and distraught, received her in the small morning room where the curtains were half drawn against the light. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands. "How good of you to come. I don't know what I shall do. Everything feels so strange, as if the house itself resents me." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You mustn't think so, my dear. Grief makes everything unfamiliar. But you must eat a little. I've brought scones. Fresh this morning." Clara smiled faintly, more from politeness than appetite. "Thank you. I'll try. The inspector's been questioning everyone all morning. It's dreadful. He even spoke to Henry. Oh, you've met my cousin, haven't you?" "I haven't had the pleasure yet," said Miss Marple, her eyes curious. "He arrived yesterday after hearing the news. He's been rather forceful. Insists that Aunt Beatrice must have been murdered, and that it was someone within the house. And do you agree with him? Clara hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know what to think. Aunt Beatrice could be difficult, yes, but she wasn't cruel. She liked things done her way, but she wasn't evil. Her voice trembled. I can't imagine anyone wanting her dead. Miss Marple smiled gently, though her eyes said otherwise. My dear, one never truly knows what seeds of resentment may lie hidden in human hearts. Sometimes the most respectable households have the darkest soil. As she rose to leave, the door opened, and a tall man stepped in, broad-shouldered, with a face lined from weather and whiskey. His eyes, sharp and restless, flicked from Miss Marple to Clara. Ah, the famous Miss Marple, he said with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've heard of you. Henry Fenton. My aunt's, well, was her nephew. How do you do, Mr. Fenton? Said Miss Marple with her characteristic mildness. A most unfortunate occasion for our meeting. Unfortunate indeed, he said, his voice low. I'd give a great deal to know who's responsible for it. Beatrice and I weren't close, but murder's another matter. Murder is seldom impersonal, Miss Marple murmured. It usually springs from the very things that make us human. Love, envy, pride, or fear. Do you think your aunt feared someone, Mr. Fenton? He looked at her sharply. Fear? No, Beatrice feared no one. She was the one people feared. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, then perhaps that is where we must begin. When she had gone, she took the longer path back through the village, allowing her thoughts to settle. Fear and pride, those were dangerous companions, and Lady Beatrice had likely courted both. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed Inspector Cray emerging from the rectory gate, his moustache bristling with agitation. Miss Marple, he called, striding toward her. We've just found something peculiar in the late lady's study. A small vial, medicine bottle, unlabeled, half empty. Dr. Hayward thinks it contained laurel water. Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. Laurel water? That would account for the cyanide, certainly. But then the question remains, why would Lady Beatrice have such a thing in her possession? That's what we're trying to find out, Craig grunted. Her maid says she used it occasionally to scent her linen, though that sounds like nonsense to me. We're checking all the staff, but so far no one's admitted to touching it. Between you and me, I'm beginning to suspect the niece. Clara? Miss Marple's tone was faintly reproving. Surely not. She strikes me as the sort who faints at unpleasantness, not one who administers it. Appearances deceive, Miss Marple. Seen it too many times. The girl inherits everything now. Motive enough. Indeed, Miss Marple said, but so would Henry if Clara were no longer around to claim it. Cray frowned. You think? I think, she interrupted gently, that inheritance is a very sharp knife, Inspector. It cuts both ways. That evening the village gathered once more in small whispering clusters. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains. Shadows moved in parlours. At the Blue Boar, men spoke in low tones over their pints, speculating about poison and money. At the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley confided to the vicar's wife that Lady Beatrice had once dismissed a servant under strange circumstances. Every word fed the growing storm of suspicion. At home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a single candle burning beside her notebook. She had written down 3 names, Clara, Henry, Mrs. Finch. Beneath them a simple question: who had the opportunity to handle the cup? She reviewed the details with the patient clarity of a woman who had once watched a maid steal silver sugar tongs, and learned from that small deception all she needed to know about human frailty: the rinsed teacup, the faint smell of almonds, the unlabeled bottle. Nothing about Lady Beatrice's death was random. It was deliberate, but delicately so, a crime executed by someone who understood not violence but subtlety. She looked up, hearing the faint toll of the church bell. It was late. Beyond her window, Maplewood Manor loomed dark against the horizon, its many windows like closed eyes. Somewhere inside, Miss Marple knew, someone lay awake as well, listening to the ticking of time, waiting for the next move. and as the last ember in her hearth flickered to ash, Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, "The thing about truth is it never stays buried for long. It only waits for the right hand to uncover it." The following day broke sharp and bright, the mist of the previous morning burned away by a brisk autumn sun. The light fell cold and clear upon Maplewood Manor, making its ivy-clad facade seem somehow less stately, more watchful. The village had settled into that uneasy quiet that always follows sudden tragedy, the lull between whispers when everyone waits for the next revelation. Inside the manor, the air was taut with expectation. Inspector Cray had summoned the principal household members for further questioning, and Miss Marple, by virtue of her helpful witnesses' recollections, had been invited to observe. It was a role she accepted with her usual humility and a faint, knowing smile. The drawing-room was much as it had been the day of the fete, flowers wilting slightly in their vases, a faint trace of perfume lingering like a ghost. Clara Fenton sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, her gloved hands clasped tightly together, while Mrs. Finch hovered nearby, dabbing her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. Henry Fenton stood apart, his stance defiant, the faint smell of tobacco clinging to his jacket. Inspector Cray entered with the measured authority of a man who enjoyed the weight of silence before speech. "Now then," he began, taking a seat at the writing desk, "we've confirmed the poison was laurel water, homemade most likely, and administered shortly before Lady Beatrice's death. What we need to determine is who had both access and motive. I'll remind you all, it's quite serious business. Premeditated poisoning carries no light sentence." Henry gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You think one of us did it, Inspector? Family murder's rather fashionable these days, I suppose." Clara turned on him sharply. "Henry, please!" "This isn't the time." Cray's gaze flicked between them. "You two weren't on good terms with your aunt, were you?" Clara's eyes widened. "That's not true. We had our disagreements, certainly, but I loved her." Henry snorted. "Loved her purse strings, perhaps." The words hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, then stopped. "Money," she said quietly, "has a most disagreeable way of unsettling even the kindest relations. Though it's curious, isn't it, that Lady Beatrice's will had only just been revised. Such timing often proves most unfortunate." Cray looked at her keenly. "You've heard something about that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, one hears so much in the course of conversation," she replied with mild vagueness. "Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned that the solicitor, Mr. Denham, visited only last week. A diligent young man, rather devoted to Miss Clara, if I'm not mistaken." Clara's face flushed scarlet. "That's not— He was simply helping Aunt with legal matters." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, "though it's rare that such matters remain purely legal for long." Henry gave her a sharp look. "Are you suggesting my cousin and the solicitor conspired? For heaven's sake, the girl can barely boil an egg without supervision." Cray cut in briskly. "Enough, Mr. Fenton. We'll see what Mr. Denham has to say before making any conclusions." He scribbled a note, then turned toward Mrs. Finch. "Now, Mrs. Finch, you rinsed the teacup." "Why?" The housekeeper looked startled. Oh, sir, it was instinct. The tray was left in the orangery, and I thought it untidy, what with the fete still going on. I never dreamed it would be important." "Convenient instinct," Henry muttered. Her lips trembled. "I've served this family 20 years, Mr. Fenton. I'd never harm my lady." "Never!" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle. "No one is accusing you, my dear, though I imagine your duties kept you quite occupied that afternoon. Perhaps someone else might have gone to the tea things before you did." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then said in a low voice, "Now that you mention it, Mr. Denham was near the orangery a few minutes before the scream. I saw him walking that way, though I thought nothing of it at the time." "Denham again," murmured Cray. "Seems he's everywhere at once." Henry's smile was cold. "Oh, our earnest young solicitor. Always eager to help, especially when it involves a lady and a fortune." Clara rose abruptly. "You will not speak of him that way." Her voice trembled, but her eyes blazed with sudden defiance. For the first time since the fete, she looked alive. Miss Marple noted it carefully. Love or guilt had a way of waking the spirit. Cray stood, his patience thinning. That will be all for now. None of you are to leave the village. I'll be paying Mr. Denham a visit next. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered behind. She drifted toward the desk, where a letter lay half open among Lady Beatrice's papers. "If I might, Inspector," she said softly, "this appears to be addressed to Miss Clara, but it's unsigned." Cray glanced over her shoulder. The letter read in neat angular handwriting, "Some debts can only be paid in silence. Trust no one until the will is read." There was no signature, only the faint impression of a ring pressed into the paper, as though the writer had paused too long before folding it. Miss Marple studied the mark. It was circular with a small notch, something like a family crest, perhaps. "How odd," she murmured, almost as though the writer wished to be recognized and yet remain hidden. Cray looked puzzled. "What do you make of it?" "Oh, I should think it's meant for misdirection," she replied. "Threats disguised as warnings or warnings mistaken for threats. It depends entirely on whose conscience is troubled." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took tea at her cottage, her mind quietly turning the pieces over. She had seen such patterns before. A proud woman with enemies cloaked as kin, a poison drawn from familiarity, a letter written in haste or guilt. The key, she felt certain, lay not in the poison itself but in the emotion that prompted it. Love and pride, those twin engines of folly, were almost always at work. Her reverie was broken by a hesitant knock at the door. When she opened it, she found young Michael Denham standing there, hat in hand, raincoat damp from the lingering drizzle. His usually confident expression was gone, replaced by something tight and anxious. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "I heard you were assisting the inspector. I had to speak to someone impartial." "Do come in, Mr. Denham," she said pleasantly. "The kettle's just boiled." He sat opposite her, hands clasped, eyes darting to the hearth as if seeking warmth from more than the fire. "They think I killed her," he said bluntly. "Cray all but accused me." "I swear to you I didn't." Miss Marple poured his tea. "The innocent often protest first, but they also protest truest. Tell me, Mr. Denham, why were you near the orangery?" He hesitated. "Clara asked me to fetch a document from her aunt's study, the new will. Lady Beatrice wanted it locked in the strong-box after the fete. I was on my way back when I heard the scream. That's the truth." Miss Marple stirred her own cup thoughtfully. "The will. How very central it seems to everything. Did you read it?" He looked up sharply. "Only briefly. It leaves the manor and most assets to Miss Clara, but with one curious stipulation: the property must not be sold outside the family." "If it is, the inheritance passes to Henry." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "a clever clause. It binds both niece and nephew to the same fortune, and thus the same suspicion." Denham leaned forward. "You don't think Clara had anything to do with it, do you?" "She's incapable of deceit." Miss Marple gave him a long, quiet look. "My dear young man, everyone is capable of deceit when driven by fear or love. It's the reason truth so rarely stands alone." He dropped his gaze, ashamed. "Then what should I do?" "Tell the inspector everything, even the parts that make you uncomfortable. Secrets left to fester only darken the air around them. And if you truly wish to help Miss Clara, you'll do it not by defending her, but by clearing the fog that surrounds her." After he left, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room was still save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. She thought of the letter again, its strange phrasing, the pressure of the ring in the paper, and the way guilt had trembled in every voice she'd heard that day. Something unseen threaded these people together, something older than greed and deeper than fear. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping the lane with a restless sigh. Miss Marple turned to the window and watched the clouds gather once more over Maplewood Manor. It loomed there, proud and silent, as if the house itself guarded its own secret. "Very well," she murmured. as though to an unseen audience. If the dead will not speak, the living must. And they will sooner than they think. She picked up her knitting again, her needles gleaming faintly in the firelight. Each measured click echoed the steady patience of her mind. The pattern was forming, and she knew, though no one else yet did, that before long the next stitch would draw blood. The next morning brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had grown weary of its own speculation. A soft breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke, but within that stillness lay a nervous expectancy. The story of Lady Beatrice's death had moved beyond mere gossip. It had become a riddle that everyone, from the butcher to the vicar, fancied themselves fit to solve. Yet beneath the chatter, an undercurrent of fear had begun to stir. Fear that the murderer might still walk among them, smiling as they always had. At her breakfast table, Miss Marple read a short notice in the Melchester Gazette. Investigation continues into mysterious death at Maplewood Manor. Police seek clarification on timeline. The tone of the article was restrained, but she knew the truth of such phrases. Clarification, in police language, meant confusion. Inspector Cray was no fool, but subtlety was never his strongest tool. This particular mystery required delicacy, and Miss Marple had long ago learned that human behavior, not evidence, was where truth lay hidden. By mid-morning, she had tied on her hat and set off for the vicarage. Mrs. Price Ridley had invited her for tea, or perhaps it was more accurate to say, invited herself to talk while Miss Marple listened. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted at once with an eager whisper. "My dear Jane, I've heard the most astonishing thing. The maid at Maplewood, Elsie, you remember her? She says she saw Clara Fenton in the study the very morning of the fete, and she wasn't alone." Miss Marple raised her brows with polite interest. "Not alone, you say?" "Precisely. A gentleman was there. She couldn't see his face, but he was wearing a dark coat. And there was talk, raised voices apparently. Something about papers and what would be discovered soon." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. "It must have been that solicitor fellow, Mr. Denham. Who else could it be?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps. But one must be cautious about what maids see. Often they observe much and understand little. Though, to be fair, sometimes it is quite the opposite." The vicar's wife, who had been quietly listening, asked, "Do you really think Miss Fenton could be involved, Miss Marple? She seems such a gentle creature." "Gentle creatures are not exempt from passion," Miss Marple said softly. "In fact, they are often the ones who, when provoked, act most decisively. It is those who hide their tempers who frighten me most." When she returned home, she found Inspector Cray waiting on her garden path, his bowler hat tucked beneath his arm, and a harried look about him. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'll admit I could use your insight. We've had a development. The laboratory confirms Lady Beatrice ingested the poison about 15 minutes before her death. That narrows the window considerably." "How interesting," she replied. "And who was with her during that time?" Cray sighed. "That's the problem. According to witnesses, she was sitting in the orangery alone for several minutes. Then Clara joined her to bring a parasol. Denham was seen near the terrace, and Mrs. Finch claims she went in briefly to clear plates. All three had the opportunity." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Mr. Henry Fenton? He says he was on the drive, telephoning a business associate in London. No one can confirm it, but the call was made. The exchange clerk remembers connecting it." "A well-timed alibi," Miss Marple murmured. "Though even alibis can sometimes be as fragile as teacups," Cray frowned. "You've got a way of making the simplest things sound suspicious, Miss Marple." "I've found they often are," she said. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Finch at the manor, ostensibly to deliver some preserves. The housekeeper, red-eyed and jittery, ushered her into the kitchen, where the copper pots gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Oh, Miss Marple," she sighed, "this business is wearing me to pieces. The inspectors asked me the same questions over and over. What I saw, what I did. I can't remember half of it properly anymore. Miss Marple sat at the table folding her hands. Memory can be a tricky thing under strain. Perhaps you'd tell me just what you do recall quietly now from the beginning. Mrs. Finch took a deep breath. Well, after tea was served, I was called to fetch more sugar. When I returned, Lady Beatrice was speaking sharply to someone, though I couldn't see who. Then I went back to the kitchen. Later I remembered the tray still in the orangery, so I went to fetch it, and that's when Miss Clara screamed. Speaking sharply, Miss Marple repeated. You didn't recognize the voice? The housekeeper shook her head. No, but there was something about it. Firm, quick, a man's tone, I'd say. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Finch, that's most helpful. As she left, she paused in the hallway, her eyes resting on a portrait of Lady Beatrice in younger years, a proud woman with eyes that dared the world to oppose her. Beneath it hung a small key rack, each brass hook labelled neatly. One tag read Study Cabinet, another Orangery. The hook for Study Cabinet was empty. Later that evening, as dusk folded over the village, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, reviewing what she had learned. The missing key troubled her. The letter to Clara hinted at knowledge or fear. Someone had intended for secrets to stay buried. The question was, whose secrets? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. When she opened the door, it was Clara Fenton herself, looking pale and windblown, her cloak damp from mist. Miss Marple, she said in a low, trembling voice, I shouldn't be here, but I don't know who else to trust. The inspector believes I'm hiding something. Perhaps I am, but not what he thinks. Miss Marple gestured her inside, guiding her to the fire. Sit, my dear. Start from the beginning. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. Aunt Beatrice found out about me and Michael. She thought it disgraceful that a Fenton girl should marry a solicitor's assistant. She threatened to disinherit me unless I ended it. That morning I went to plead with her to change her mind. She said there was something in her study, something that would make me understand. Then she sent me away. I never saw her alive again. Miss Marple listened, her expression calm but her mind alert. Did she tell you what that something was? Clara shook her head. No, but after she died I searched the study and there was nothing unusual, except that one of the drawers was locked. I couldn't find the key. Miss Marple's eyes softened. That explains our little mystery hook. Clara looked puzzled. Hook? Never mind, dear. Tell me, did your aunt wear any particular ring that day? Clara hesitated. Yes, her garnet one. She never took it off. Red stone, square cut? Yes, why? Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze distant. Because the letter you received, the one found in your aunt's study, bore the impression of that very ring. Which means, Miss Clara, that your aunt wrote it herself. Clara gasped. Then she knew something. Indeed, Miss Marple said quietly. And I think she meant to reveal it. Only someone made certain she never had the chance. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Do you think it was Henry? Miss Marple hesitated before answering. I think, she said gently, that your aunt was clever enough to trap whoever she feared. The truth now lies not in her death, but in what she left behind. And I suspect, before the night is out, that someone will try very hard to retrieve it. Clara shivered, drawing her shawl tighter. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window. Outside, the darkness pressed against the glass. Across the lane, a single light gleamed faintly from the direction of Maplewood Manor, its study window. Go home now, my dear, she said softly, and lock your door. Leave the rest to me. When the door closed behind her, Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and sat in the half-light, her knitting needles silent for once. She waited. Somewhere beyond the quiet tick of the clock, she could almost hear the faint creak of a floorboard, the rustle of footsteps upon the lane. The trap, she thought, was nearly sprung, for truth, as she well knew, was like laurel water. It might be sweet to the taste, but it always burned in the end. Night descended thick and low over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a hush, broken only by the occasional sigh of wind through the hedgerows. Within her small parlour, Miss Marple sat motionless by the dying fire, her eyes half closed, though her mind remained acutely awake. Every detail of the past few days lay arranged in her thoughts like pieces of fine china, each fragile, each part of a greater pattern. Somewhere among them, the truth waited to be revealed. The faint ticking of the mantel clock marked the slow passage of time. And then, just as the hands reached 10:30, came the sound she had been expecting, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path outside her window. She did not move, save for the smallest tilt of her head. The latch of her gate clicked softly. A figure passed the hedge, shadowy, careful, and unmistakably deliberate. Miss Marple rose without haste, lifting her shawl from the chair and stepping quietly to the window. Through the dim reflection of her own face, she saw the figure turn up the road toward Maplewood Manor. The study window, visible even from her cottage, still glowed faintly with a single light. Whoever was abroad at this hour meant to reach it, and soon. 5 minutes later, Miss Marple had wrapped herself in a dark cloak and was following the same path, her steps sure and soundless upon the damp earth. She knew every twist of the lane, every gate-post and hollow tree. Years of village life had trained her to move unnoticed. People seldom looked twice at a quiet old woman. From a distance she saw the manor looming ahead, its windows like pale eyes against the night. The faint gleam of a lantern moved across the lower floor, disappearing toward the study. She waited a few moments, then approached the side entrance, which, as she suspected, had been left unlatched. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polish and old paper. The corridor stretched long and dark before her, ending in a thin strip of light seeping beneath the study door. A soft rustle came from within, the scrape of a drawer being forced open. Miss Marple advanced with the patience of a cat, each step measured and noiseless. When she reached the doorway, she paused, peering through the narrow gap. A man stood by the desk, Henry Fenton. His coat was open, his face drawn and set. In one hand he held a small lamp, in the other a key that he was turning in the lock of the central drawer. The faint metallic click seemed loud in the silence. After a moment's struggle, the drawer yielded, and Henry thrust it open. Papers spilled out. He rifled through them with trembling fingers, cursing under his breath. Then his hand froze. From the very back of the drawer, he drew out a sealed envelope marked in Lady Beatrice's firm handwriting, "To be opened only in the event of my death." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. Henry tore the envelope open, scanning its contents in haste. Whatever he read turned his features to stone. The letter fluttered from his grasp, and he leaned heavily against the desk. "So," he whispered, his voice low and harsh, "the old witch knew." He turned sharply at the faint creak of a floorboard. Miss Marple stepped into the doorway, her expression one of calm reproach. "Good evening, Mr. Fenton," she said quietly. "An unusual hour for correspondence, wouldn't you agree?" Henry stiffened, his eyes flashing with panic. What are you doing here?" "Oh, much the same as you, I imagine," she replied, "following curiosity where it leads. Though mine tends not to involve locked drawers and broken seals." He took a step toward her, but she did not move. "You don't understand," he said. "This letter, it lies. It's poison, just like everything else my aunt touched." "Poison is a rather recurring theme with your family of late," Miss Marple said mildly. "Perhaps you might explain what the letter says before we assume its character." Henry hesitated, then snatched the paper from the floor and thrust it toward her. "Read it, then. See for yourself." Miss Marple took it delicately and adjusted her spectacles. Lady Beatrice's handwriting marched neatly across the page. "To my solicitor and to those concerned, should I die under circumstances that provoke inquiry, let it be known that I have reason to believe one among my kin seeks my death for the sake of inheritance. I have placed in the keeping of my study cabinet certain documents proving the extent of debts incurred by Henry Fenton and his attempts to secure my signature under false pretenses. Should this letter be found, he is to be considered suspect until proven innocent. Miss Marple looked up. Henry's breath came fast. She wanted to ruin me, he said hoarsely. Those debts were settled years ago. She was senile, mad even. Mad enough to predict her own murder, Miss Marple asked softly. Henry's hand went to his pocket. You think I did it. You're like the rest of them. You've no idea. She was cruel. She used us all like pieces on her chessboard. Cruelty may be an unlovely trait, Miss Marple said, but it seldom justifies murder. He turned away sharply, pacing the floor. You've no proof. None of you do. Not yet, she said gently, but we shall. The truth always emerges, Mr. Fenton. It's rather like ink. It seeps through paper, no matter how thick the disguise. He stopped pacing, shoulders rigid. Then you'll have to find it without me. Before she could speak, he moved toward the window, unlatching it with a violent jerk. But just as he began to climb through, the door burst open behind them. Inspector Cray filled the doorway, his revolver raised. That'll do, Mr. Fenton, he said. We've heard quite enough. Henry froze. The lamplight caught the sweat on his brow. For a moment he seemed about to bolt, but then his shoulders sagged. He dropped the letter and raised his hands. Cray crossed the room swiftly, snapping handcuffs over the man's wrists. Caught you red-handed, eh? Trying to destroy evidence, were you? Henry's voice was dull. You don't know what you're doing. Oh, I think we do, Cray said grimly. You poisoned your aunt to keep your debts quiet, and you'd have done the same to anyone else who found out. You'll hang for this, Fenton. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, lifted a hand. If I may, Inspector, I wouldn't be too hasty. It's possible Mr. Fenton came here not to destroy, but to retrieve something. Something he feared would be used against him. Fear, after all, can drive a man to foolish acts, even if he's innocent of worse ones. Cray frowned. You can't still think he's innocent, Miss Marple. Everything points to him. On the contrary, she said, everything points to someone who wanted him to appear guilty. Forgive me, but guilt rarely behaves with such clumsy transparency. Real murderers prefer quieter paths. Henry stared at her, confusion and hope warring in his eyes. You don't think— I think, Miss Marple said, folding the letter neatly, that Lady Beatrice's enemies were more numerous than even she imagined. You see, poison is a woman's weapon, subtle, precise, and often chosen by those who understand domestic arts far better than legal ones. Cray's brow furrowed. You mean— Miss Marple gave a small, tired smile. I mean that while you were busy chasing debt and inheritance, you overlooked the simplest truth. The hand that pours the tea is the one no one ever suspects. As if summoned by her words, a faint sound drifted from the corridor, a quick, startled gasp, followed by the clatter of a dropped tray. Cray turned sharply, but Miss Marple only sighed. Ah, she said softly, and here we have our listener. Mrs. Finch stood in the doorway, her face pale as paper, eyes wide with terror. I didn't mean— oh, mercy, I didn't mean to, she stammered. She was cruel to me too, Miss Marple. Always scolding, always threatening to turn me out after 20 years. I only wanted to frighten her. Just a little, enough to make her respect me. But then she drank it all. Her voice broke into sobs. The silence that followed was deep and terrible. Cray's face hardened as he stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. No, Inspector. Let her speak. She's not wicked, only desperate. And desperation, I'm afraid, is the most dangerous motive of all. Mrs. Finch sank into a chair, trembling. It was the laurel water. I'd used it for cleaning once. I thought a drop in her cup would make her ill, not kill her, Miss Marple finished softly. But poison seldom listens to intentions, my dear. Cray cuffed the woman silently. Henry watched, pale and speechless, as they led her from the room. Miss Marple remained standing by the hearth, her eyes on the flickering shadows cast by the lamplight. When they were gone, she looked down at the letter once more. Poor Lady Beatrice, she murmured. For all her pride, she never understood that her downfall would come not from greed, but from hurt feelings and housekeeping. She replaced the letter in its drawer and turned toward the window, where dawn's first light was beginning to stain the horizon. Another secret laid bare, another human frailty exposed, and somewhere in the stillness of the waking village, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest sigh, not of satisfaction, but of pity, for those who could never see that murder, like love, was always a matter of human nature. The dawn that followed was a pale, reluctant thing, seeping slowly into the streets of St. Mary Mead, as though hesitant to disturb the uneasy quiet that lingered after the night's revelations. Miss Marple had slept little. The events at Maplewood Manor, Mrs. Finch's tearful confession, Henry's bitter defiance, the inspector's heavy-handed triumph, had left her mind occupied not with satisfaction but with doubt. Things had fallen into place a little too neatly, and Miss Marple, who trusted her instincts far more than appearances, felt an unmistakable disquiet stirring within her. At 7:30, she sat by the window of her small sitting-room, a shawl drawn over her shoulders, watching the thin mist curl along the lane. The kettle whistled softly, and as she poured her tea she recalled Mrs. Finch's words from the night before. "I only meant to frighten her." That phrase troubled her deeply. It carried the unmistakable ring of truth, but it also implied ignorance. Mrs. Finch had said she used the laurel water for cleaning once, but laurel water was not kept in the cleaning cupboard. It had been stored in Lady Beatrice's locked cabinet. How then had Mrs. Finch obtained it? Unless, of course, someone else had placed it where she could easily find it. At precisely 8 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Cray standing there, looking more tired than triumphant. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "I thought I'd stop by." "There are developments." "Do come in, Inspector," she said, gesturing him toward the hearth. "Tea?" He accepted with a grunt, settling into the armchair opposite her. "We've had the chemist confirm it," he said. "The laurel water Mrs. Finch used came from a bottle found in the pantry, not the study cabinet. The labels matched, same mixture. She must have taken it from there without realizing how strong it was." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, passing him his cup. "And yet I recall distinctly that Lady Beatrice was in the habit of keeping her laurel water in her private stores, for her linens. Wouldn't it be strange for a second bottle to appear in the servants' pantry?" Cray frowned. "You think someone planted it there?" "I think," she said gently, "that Lady Beatrice was too particular to have such things duplicated. A woman of her temperament kept control of every household detail. To have 2 bottles of laurel water in the same house, well, that seems not merely careless but deliberate." The inspector scratched his head. "But Mrs. Finch confessed." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but confessions are often the result of fear rather than guilt. Poor Mrs. Finch was terrified, a view of the law of her own conscience. But that does not mean she told the truth as it happened, only as she believed it must have been." Cray sighed, rubbing his brow. "You think there's someone else behind it all?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "I do, and I believe that person understood Mrs. Finch very well. Her routines, her loyalty, her sense of duty. Someone who could rely on her to tidy away things without question." The inspector stared into his tea, thoughtful now. "You've someone in mind?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet, but I intend to." Later that morning she walked to the manor. The air was crisp and still, the ground damp from the night's mist. Clara Fenton met her at the door, her eyes shadowed but her manner steadier than before. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you've come," she said softly. "They've taken Mrs. Finch away and Henry's left the house. The inspector says it's over, but, well, it doesn't feel over. It feels wrong." Miss Marple gave her hand a gentle pat. "You're quite right, my dear. Wrong is exactly the word. May I see the study again?" Clara led her through the hall, where dust motes drifted in pale beams of light. The study was just as they had left it, the air faintly scented with paper and faded perfume. Miss Marple crossed to the cabinet and examined the drawers carefully. One still locked caught her attention. "This key," she said, glancing up, "was it ever found?" Clara shook her head. "No. Aunt kept it on her ring, I think. But the inspector said it wasn't among her belongings." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. She crouched beside the drawer, her fingers tracing the faint scratches near the keyhole. "Someone forced this after her death. Recently, I should think." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean Henry?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, straightening. "But if so, then why take only the letter, when more damaging documents remained untouched? No, my dear, Henry Fenton's sins were petty and public. The hand behind this had patience and planning." As they spoke, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Michael Denham appeared at the door, his expression troubled but earnest. "Miss Marple," he said, "the inspector sent me. He wants me to go through the will and Lady Beatrice's papers for the record." "May I?" "Of course," Miss Marple said, watching him carefully as he moved toward the desk. He began sorting through the folders with practiced precision, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yet there was something slightly too methodical about the way he worked, as though he were aware of being observed. After a few minutes, she said casually, "You've known Miss Clara for some time, haven't you?" He paused. "Nearly 2 years. And Lady Beatrice disapproved of your attachment?" "Yes," he said grimly. "She called me an opportunist. She said I was after Clara's inheritance." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "And were you, Mr. Denham?" He flushed. "No. I loved her. I still do." "I see," Miss Marple said mildly. "Then you must forgive me for asking. Why did you lie about the will? You told me Lady Beatrice asked you to lock it away, yet Miss Clara recalls her aunt saying she intended to revise it again after the fete." Michael froze, his face draining of colour. "I must have misunderstood her." Miss Marple regarded him kindly but without mercy. "Oh, my dear boy, you didn't misunderstand. You simply hoped no one would notice. You see, it wasn't Lady Beatrice who asked you to fetch the document that day. It was someone else, someone who wanted to ensure the will was signed and sealed before the fete began. Because if Lady Beatrice had lived 1 day longer, she would have changed it again, and then perhaps the solicitor's assistant would have found himself left with nothing but regret." He stared at her, stricken. "You can't prove that." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple said gently, "but I think the inspector will find your fingerprints on the cabinet key, the one Lady Beatrice kept on her ring until it was removed after her death." The silence that followed was dreadful. Then, in a low, defeated voice, he said, "She was going to destroy me. I'd risked everything for Clara, and she meant to take it all away. I only meant to make her ill, enough to delay the new will, enough to frighten her. But she drank too quickly. I didn't mean to—" "Intent," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "has very little bearing on consequence. Mr. Denham, poison is a cruel ally. It obeys no master." He buried his face in his hands, and for a moment Miss Marple's expression softened. "You see," she said almost to herself, "it's always the same. People imagine murder to be a grand affair, born of hatred, cunning, revenge, but it's seldom that. More often it's a single moment of fear or vanity or love, and afterward, an eternity of silence." When Inspector Cray arrived moments later, summoned by a discreet note Miss Marple had sent earlier that morning, he found the young man seated motionless at the desk, the letter and key lying before him. "It's over, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "Mrs. Finch was only the last link in a chain she never knew existed." As they led Michael Denham away, Clara stood by the window, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "he didn't mean to kill her, did he?" Miss Marple sighed. "No, my dear, but that won't comfort him now, nor you. There's always a price to be paid, even for accidents of the heart." Outside, the morning sun broke through the mist, flooding the manor grounds with cold, indifferent light. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze on the fading figure of the young man being led down the path. Then she turned away, her face calm, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "In the end," she said, The truth is like laurel water. Bitter to taste, but it cleanses all it touches. The village wore its usual calm the next morning, though it was a calm born of exhaustion rather than peace. The affair at Maplewood Manor had left its mark. One could feel it in the hushed tones exchanged outside the post office, in the way shopkeepers lowered their voices when strangers entered. It was as though the whole of St. Mary Mead held its breath, unwilling to exhale until Miss Marple herself had spoken the final word on the tragedy. And yet, even as Inspector Cray considered the case closed and the newspapers began to fade from talk of murder to weather, Miss Marple's mind refused to rest. There remained a faint but unmistakable unease that tugged at her thoughts, something small, something out of place, like a loose stitch in an otherwise perfect piece of knitting. She spent the morning tending to her garden, clipping the last of the chrysanthemums. It was peaceful work, and in that quiet her mind turned again to the puzzle. Michael Denham's confession had seemed convincing enough, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that sincerity and truth were not always the same. He had admitted to tampering with the laurel water, but his story contained peculiarities, little inconsistencies that refused to be smoothed over. He claimed he had wanted only to make Lady Beatrice ill, to delay the revision of her will. Yet how had he known of her intent to change it again? Only Clara and Lady Beatrice herself had discussed that matter privately. Unless someone else had overheard. Just then the gate creaked. It was Clara Fenton, pale and wan, wrapped in a light shawl, though the morning air was still crisp. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "may I come in? I don't wish to disturb you, but I can't bear to be alone in that house any longer." "My dear, of course," said Miss Marple, leading her inside. "Sit by the fire." "I was just making tea." Clara sank into the armchair, her hands trembling slightly. "I keep seeing it all over again. The fate, the orangery, Aunt's cup lying there. And now, Michael, I don't know what to think any more. He wasn't capable of murder." Miss Marple poured the tea with her usual care. "Capability," she said gently, "is a most peculiar thing. Few people imagine themselves capable of terrible acts until the moment they are driven to them. But even so, I'm not quite certain that what happened was entirely as we've been told." Clara looked up, startled. "You don't believe Michael did it?" "I believe he played his part," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But I also believe there are layers to this story that we've yet to see. Lady Beatrice was a shrewd woman, and she had enemies beyond her family. Tell me, my dear, do you recall whether your aunt dismissed any servants recently?" Clara frowned, thinking. "Only one. Her companion, Miss Lydia Crane. It was rather sudden. Aunt said she was too inquisitive, though I thought her kind. She'd been with us nearly a year." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And when did she leave?" "The week before the fete. She packed that very morning and was gone by luncheon. Aunt wouldn't discuss it, and none of us dared to ask." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Curious timing. Very curious indeed. I wonder, my dear, might you recall where Miss Crane went afterward?" Clara hesitated. "She mentioned going to stay with a cousin in Melchester, I think. But I never knew the address." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in her lap. "Then perhaps it is time I paid a little visit to Melchester myself." By afternoon, she was on the train, wrapped in her grey coat and hat, appearing every inch the genteel spinster on an errand of no consequence. The rhythm of the wheels seemed to steady her thoughts. There was a faint excitement stirring beneath her composure, the quiet thrill of a mystery nearing its final unravelling. Melchester was a tidy market town, its streets lined with Georgian facades and tidy shop windows. Miss Marple made her inquiries with care, posing as an old acquaintance concerned for Miss Crane's welfare. It took less than an hour to learn that Lydia Crane had indeed taken lodgings at a small boarding house near the cathedral. The landlady, a talkative woman with more curiosity than discretion, was eager to share her impressions. "Oh, yes, Miss Crane's been here nearly a fortnight," she said, as she led Miss Marple down a narrow hall that smelled faintly of polish and lavender. "Keeps to herself mostly, though she gets quite a few letters. Such fine handwriting, too. And she's had a visitor twice. A young man, very polite, though I couldn't help but notice he never gave his name. Ah, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Would he happen to be tall, fair-haired, and rather earnest-looking? The woman's eyes widened. Why, yes, do you know him? One hears things, Miss Marple murmured, as the door at the end of the hall opened suddenly. Lydia Crane stood in the doorway, her expression one of startled recognition. She was a handsome woman in her 30s, composed but watchful. Miss Marple, she said after a brief pause. I might have known you'd come sooner or later. Miss Marple inclined her head. I do seem to have that habit, my dear. May I come in? Inside the room was neat, though the table bore a small stack of letters and an inkpot. Miss Crane gestured stiffly toward a chair. You've come about Lady Beatrice, I suppose? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Her death, and the part you played in the events that followed. Lydia gave a bitter laugh. Played? That's one way to put it. I warned her. I told her that her precious household was a nest of vipers. But she would not listen. You were dismissed because you knew too much. Because I found a bottle in her study, the same one that killed her. Lydia's eyes gleamed with anger. She said it was for the garden pests, but it was no such thing. I confronted her, and she turned me out that very morning. I thought she meant to destroy me. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. And yet you stayed close enough to receive visitors. Mr. Denham, for instance. Lydia flinched. He came only once to ask what I knew. He was desperate. I told him to stay out of it. But he didn't, Miss Marple said. And he took the bottle you spoke of, thinking to use it for his own foolish purpose. You see, my dear, Lady Beatrice didn't die by accident, nor solely by his hand. Someone ensured that what should have been a mild dose became fatal. For a moment, silence filled the small room. Then Lydia whispered, You mean the mixture was changed? Yes, said Miss Marple. The laurel water from the pantry was far stronger than the sort kept in the house. Someone prepared it beforehand, knowing precisely how events would unfold. Mrs. Finch poured the tea, Mr. Denham added his drop, and Lady Beatrice drank her death, all without any of them realizing they were but instruments. Lydia's face went pale. But who would do such a thing? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. The person who had both access and motive. The same person who stood to gain the most from Lady Beatrice's death, yet never touched the cup herself. Tell me, Miss Crane, did Lady Beatrice ever mention a second will, one she drafted before the last? Lydia nodded slowly. Yes, she said it left everything to a trust to be managed by her niece until her marriage. Precisely, said Miss Marple. And that trust was never revoked. The new will, drawn hastily and witnessed by a young man in love, was invalid the moment its maker died. Which means the estate returns to the trust, and to its executor. You, Miss Crane, Lydia's breath caught. No, surely you can't. I can, Miss Marple said, her tone soft but implacable. You arranged it all. You replaced the laurel water, knowing Denham would tamper with it. You even planted the letter that cast suspicion on Henry Fenton. It was a careful plan, one born not of greed but of resentment. You believed Lady Beatrice had cheated you of your due, and you decided to take it back. Lydia's composure broke. Her voice trembled. She promised me a legacy. Years I served her, years. She said I was like a daughter. And then she cut me out for that silly, simpering niece. What would you have done, Miss Marple? Starve on a companion's wage, while they feasted on what should have been yours? Miss Marple's eyes softened. I might have left with dignity, my dear. Bitterness is a dangerous poison. It lingers long after the cup is empty. When Inspector Cray arrived 2 hours later, he found Lydia Crane standing at the window, her hands clasped before her, her face drawn but calm. Miss Marple sat beside the table, a cup of untouched tea before her. She's confessed? He asked quietly. Not in words, Miss Marple said, but in silence, and that is usually the truest confession of all. As Lydia was led away, Miss Marple gathered her shawl and looked out at the grey, drifting clouds beyond the cathedral spire. The world outside continued as though nothing had happened. Carts rattled, children laughed, and a milkman whistled down the street. Life went on indifferent as ever. She sighed faintly, more weary than triumphant. "It's a curious thing, Inspector," she said as they walked toward the station. "Murderers so often think they can arrange death as tidily as a household account. But life, you see, never stays balanced for long. It has a way of showing the truth, one drop at a time." The following day dawned bright but brittle, as though the morning sun itself mistrusted the quiet that lay over St. Mary Mead. Word of Miss Lydia Crane's arrest spread through the village before breakfast, carried from doorstep to doorstep, with the swiftness peculiar to small places where everyone's secrets are half known already. By noon the butcher's boy, the postmistress, and even the vicar's wife could recount the tale in slightly differing but equally confident versions. Miss Marple, however, said nothing. She went about her morning with the composed patience of one who had long learned that truth rarely needed defending. It simply waited for others to catch up with it. Inspector Cray had stopped by early, his usual briskness subdued. He had the look of a man who, despite closing his case, found the conclusion sitting uneasily upon him. Miss Marple had invited him in for tea, and now the two sat in her little parlour, the fire crackling softly between them. "It's an ugly business," he said at last, turning his hat in his hands. "That woman Crane, clever as a whip, cold as ice. She planned it months ahead by the sound of it. Denham's confession only made it easier for her. She would have got away with it too if not for you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not at all, Inspector. I merely observed what others preferred to overlook. You see, most crimes depend on people believing what is most convenient, and few care to examine what is merely consistent." Cray looked at her curiously. "You mean there's still more to it?" "Not more, perhaps," she said slowly, "but something deeper. It isn't enough to say Miss Crane killed Lady Beatrice out of resentment. That may be true, but it's not the whole story. There was something personal about it, something quite intimate. Her anger wasn't just that of a disinherited employee. It was older and more bitter." Cray frowned. "You think there was blackmail involved?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over the rim of her teacup. "Not precisely, but something of that sort. Lady Beatrice was proud. Too proud, perhaps, to forgive being reminded of a shameful act. You must remember, Inspector, that in small households companions often know far more than they're ever meant to. They see letters, overhear conversations, learn which skeletons rattle most loudly in the family cupboards." Cray nodded slowly. "And Lady Beatrice was the sort who'd rather kill than be exposed. Or rather," Miss Marple said gently, "the sort who'd inspire someone else to do the killing for her." The inspector looked startled, but before he could reply there came a firm knock at the door. Miss Marple rose and opened it to find Clara Fenton standing on the threshold. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, steadier than they had been in days. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said quickly. "I heard you'd gone to Melchester yesterday. They're saying it's all settled now that Miss Crane confessed, but I had to ask you myself. Is it true? Is it really over?" Miss Marple motioned her inside. "Yes, my dear. It is over in the sense that the law has taken its course. But truth, I find, often has a longer journey than justice." Clara sat down, twisting her gloves. "I keep thinking of her, of Aunt Beatrice. I thought I knew her, but it seems I didn't at all. Was she really so cruel to Miss Crane?" "Cruel," Miss Marple mused, "is a difficult word. Lady Beatrice had a certain talent for using people without appearing to. Miss Crane's affection for her was very real once, I believe, but unreciprocated. Such affections, when rejected, curdle into dangerous things." Clara looked up sharply. "Affection? You mean she loved her?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps she loved what Lady Beatrice represented. Stability, privilege, a life she could never claim as her own. It's very common, you know. Some women mistake admiration for love, and love for resentment. Miss Crane was proud, just as your aunt was. Pride, my dear, is the root of more tragedies than wickedness ever was. The inspector stood, adjusting his coat. Well, whatever the motive, it's finished now. I'll be filing my report this afternoon. Do that, Miss Marple said, but I'd advise one small addition. You might mention that Miss Crane's actions were not born in isolation. It's possible she wasn't the only one who knew of the poison. Cray turned at the door, frowning. What do you mean? Oh, nothing pressing, she said, her tone light. Merely that I've been thinking about how easily that bottle of laurel water moved from Lady Beatrice's study to the servants' pantry. A locked drawer, a missing key, too much convenience for coincidence. I've often found that even the cleverest plot leaves one fingerprint of simplicity. Cray hesitated, studying her face. You're suggesting someone helped her? I'm suggesting, said Miss Marple, that Miss Crane may have thought she was manipulating others when in truth she was being manipulated herself. There's always someone, Inspector, who moves the pieces while believing they're out of sight. After the inspector left, Clara remained seated, staring into the fire. Oh, you don't think Miss Crane acted alone, she said finally. Miss Marple's reply was quiet. No, I do not. And neither did Lady Beatrice die alone in spirit. She carried with her the consequences of years of vanity, and those consequences often outlive even their maker. The following afternoon, the inquest was held in the parish hall. It was a sober affair, though more than half the village attended, their curiosity thinly veiled behind expressions of moral concern. Miss Marple sat toward the back, her hands folded in her lap, observing. The proceedings were brief. The evidence of Lydia Crane's guilt seemed overwhelming, yet one detail caught her attention. When the coroner read the inventory of Lady Beatrice's possessions, he noted that her jewellery, valued, appraised and sealed, was found intact, except for one missing item, a garnet ring. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The garnet ring again, the same one that had left its impression on the mysterious letter found in the study. Lydia Crane, by all accounts, had been penniless when she fled the manor. She had taken no luggage save a single valise. So how then had she obtained the ring? After the inquest, Miss Marple walked home alone. The October air was cool and clear, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. The village seemed at peace once more, yet her mind hummed with quiet certainty. The garnet ring had not gone with Miss Crane. It had vanished earlier, perhaps the night of the fete itself. When she reached her cottage, she found a letter waiting on the table, delivered by hand. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, yet hurried. She unfolded it and read, My dear Miss Marple, you were right, as you always are. There are some things pride will never allow to be spoken aloud, but I must live with the truth as you live with knowing it. For what it's worth, she would have destroyed us all if she could. Perhaps I only hastened what was inevitable. Forgive me if you can. C.F. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her knitting basket. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were grave. Clara Fenton, sweet, pale Clara, who had trembled so earnestly, wept so convincingly, had known far more than she ever admitted. It was she who had given Miss Crane access to the laurel water, perhaps even encouraged her in her plan, under the guise of confiding her aunt's cruelty. The garnet ring, absent from the inventory, would almost certainly be found in Clara's possession, hidden among her keepsakes as a token of some grim understanding between conspirators. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and sat quietly watching the evening settle outside her window. She had no intention of showing the letter to the inspector. There was no need. Justice, she reflected, was a peculiar thing. The law might stop at confession, but conscience never did. Clara would live out her days haunted by the memory of her aunt's death, and by the knowledge that she had guided another hand to murder. As the fire crackled softly, Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Her fingers moved with their usual precision, looping each thread neatly into place. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is much like wool. warm and comforting in its purpose, but full of knots when you look too closely. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. The village of St. Mary Mead lay still once more, the calm restored, though beneath it the faintest tremor of truth remained, unspoken, understood, and as always quietly observed by Miss Marple. That evening, as twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire. The light from the hearth flickered across her face, softening the fine lines of age and wisdom, though her eyes, sharp as ever, reflected something deeper, sorrow perhaps, or the quiet weight of understanding. Outside, the village lay still. Curtains were drawn, lamps glowed faintly through lace, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth after a late autumn drizzle. Within that domestic calm, she thought again of Clara Fenton, and the letter now folded away among her knitting. It had not surprised her, not truly. There had been a stillness in Clara that Miss Marple recognized, the calm of someone who has already done something unforgivable and resigned herself to living with it. The law, Miss Marple reflected, was concerned with what could be proved. Conscience, on the other hand, had no such boundaries. It made its own justice. Yet even so she could not shake a faint unease. Clara's note had been a farewell of sorts, not an admission alone, but a closing act, as though she meant to slip quietly from the stage of her own making. Before she could think further, there came a knock at the door, a quick, uncertain rapping. When she opened it, Inspector Cray stood there again, his hat in his hand, his face drawn. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple," he said gravely. "There's been a development." She stepped aside without a word, motioning him toward the fire. He sat heavily, his hands clasped between his knees. "It's Miss Fenton," he said after a pause. "She's gone. Left Maplewood Manor sometime last night. The housekeeper found a note this morning. Sounded almost like a confession, but nothing clear enough for the coroner to act on. Said she was going to make things right." Miss Marple's hands folded in her lap. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, but we've had word from the station. Someone matching her description took the early train to London." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, that would be her way, quietly, without fuss. London is a very fine place to lose oneself in." Cray rubbed his temples. "Do you think she means to harm herself?" Miss Marple hesitated, then shook her head. "No. Clara Fenton is not the sort to take her own life. She believes herself a martyr, not a criminal." "No, Inspector. I think she intends to make amends in the only way she knows how, by controlling what remains of her aunt's fortune, perhaps by claiming she was misled by others. Pride again, you see. Always pride." He gave a tired sigh. "Then what should we do?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "we let her believe she's still unseen. When pride walks hand in hand with guilt, it has a way of revealing itself eventually." 2 days later, word reached St. Mary Mead that Clara Fenton had been found in London. She had presented herself at the office of Lady Beatrice's solicitor, pale but composed, and requested to make a formal declaration concerning her aunt's estate. Michael Denham's name, she insisted, was to be cleared of all charges. She alone bore the blame for influencing him. The statement was oddly phrased, full of grand self-reproach and moral sorrow, but it was enough for the authorities to reopen the file. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, felt only a faint, weary satisfaction. Clara, she knew, had at last begun to feel the edges of her own conscience press in upon her. When Inspector Cray called again a week later, it was to deliver the final word. "They've settled the case in London," he said. "Miss Fenton's confession was accepted. Manslaughter by misadventure, they're calling it. The solicitor says she's to take a small allowance, and the rest of the estates to be held in trust for charitable use, per Lady Beatrice's earlier instructions." He paused, then added more quietly, "She's going abroad. Somewhere on the continent, I believe. France or Italy." Miss Marple looked into the fire, her expression unreadable. "How very appropriate," she murmured. A change of scenery can do wonders, though it seldom changes what one carries inside. Cray rose to go, his manner awkward. Well, that's the end of it, I suppose. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I don't think any of them got what they deserved. Not really. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Few ever do, Inspector. The world has a way of distributing consequences unevenly, but in the end it all balances out in its own fashion. When he had gone, she sat for a long while in silence. Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour, their sound drifting softly over the rooftops. The garden beyond her window lay still, the last of the roses shivering faintly in the wind. She thought of Lady Beatrice, imperious, manipulative, yet somehow pitiable, of Lydia Crane, whose devotion had turned to bitterness, of Michael Denham, young and foolish, his future now forever shadowed by one fatal choice, and of Clara Fenton, whose quiet cruelty had been masked so long by gentleness that even she had come to believe in it. It was not, she reflected, a story of villains and victims. It was, like most tragedies, simply a story of human beings, each too proud or too frightened to act rightly until it was too late. Lady Beatrice had wielded control, Lydia resentment, Michael desperation, Clara deceit. And beneath them all ran that same thread of vanity and fear that tied every human heart together in the end. That night, Miss Marple took her usual place by the window. The sky was a dark velvet dome, scattered with faint stars, and somewhere in the distance a night train passed, its whistle low and mournful. She wondered if Clara sat aboard one such train now, watching the countryside slip away, believing herself free of the past. But one cannot escape one's own reflection, Miss Marple thought. It travels with you silent and patient, until at last it demands to be faced. She rose, drew the curtains, and returned to her chair. The fire burned low, its embers glowing red. On the mantel stood a small photograph of a younger Miss Marple, taken long ago at her nephew's wedding, a reminder perhaps that even innocence was once untried. She regarded it for a moment, then smiled softly. "Ah, Jane," she murmured to herself, "you've seen it all before. The faces change, the motives repeat, and still the heart learns nothing new." Outside, a soft wind stirred the branches, whispering through the garden like a voice half-remembered. The clock struck midnight, its sound deep and measured. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, folded her hands neatly, and let her eyes rest on the dying fire. There would be another case some day, another small tragedy born of jealousy, love, or pride. There always was. For now, though, the village slept, and justice, imperfect, incomplete, but sufficient, had been done. She reached for the teapot, poured herself a final cup, and allowed herself a small sigh of contentment. "Poor Lady Beatrice," she said softly. "So many schemes, so little peace. Yet I suppose, in her way, she's brought us all together." And with that Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile playing at her lips as the fire's last glow faded into ash. In the quiet of her little cottage, surrounded by the ticking of clocks and the whisper of the night beyond the window, she sat as she always did when a mystery was finished, not triumphant, but reflective, her mind already turning, like the pages of a well-loved book, toward whatever story life would place before her next. For in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple well knew, evil seldom vanished. It merely rested, waiting patiently for its next polite invitation to tea. The weeks that followed passed quietly, as such weeks often do in St. Mary Mead after a scandal. The autumn leaves had long since fallen, carpeting the churchyard in a patchwork of gold and brown, and the first frosts were beginning to touch the hedgerows. The gossip had moved on from Maplewood Manor to more immediate concerns: the quality of the vicar's new sermon, Mrs. Bantry's questionable Christmas pudding, and the state of the High Street pavements. Yet beneath all the usual chatter, the shadow of Lady Beatrice's death lingered, a faint echo of unease that would not quite fade. Miss Marple, for her part, did not dwell on it. Or rather, She did not seem to. Her days followed their usual rhythm. A little gardening when the weather allowed, letters to her nephew Raymond, tea with Dolly Bantry, and the steady, soothing rhythm of her knitting. But behind her mild blue eyes, she continued to turn the puzzle over, not from doubt or vanity, but from that peculiar sense of duty that lived quietly at the core of her being, the duty to understand why people did what they did. For to her it was never enough to know who had killed. The greater mystery always lay in why they had felt they must. One late afternoon, as the first snow began to fall in soft, soundless flakes, Miss Marple received a letter from abroad. The postmark read Florence. The handwriting was careful, unmistakably familiar. "My dear Miss Marple, I hope you will not think it presumptuous of me to write. I am well, though still haunted by all that has passed. I live now quietly among strangers, and perhaps that is what I deserve. I have done my best to see that what remains of my aunt's fortune does some good in the world. There is little else I can offer by way of amends. Yet I wanted you to know that your kindness has not been forgotten. You saw what others could not or would not, and you spared me the worst of the law's judgment. If I may say so, you have a way of seeing straight through to the heart of things. I think in time I may even learn to forgive myself. Yours sincerely, Clara Fenton." Miss Marple read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it among her correspondence. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet melancholy. Forgiveness, she thought, was the rarest of virtues, not for others but for oneself. Clara might live to an old age and still never find it completely. That evening, Dolly Bantry came by with her usual burst of energy, shaking the snow from her boots. "I see you've had post," she said cheerfully. "From your Italian admirer, no doubt." Miss Marple smiled. "Not quite, my dear. Merely the closing of a chapter." "Oh, that dreadful business. I still can't make sense of it all. Fancy that plain-looking companion being a murderess. And Clara, poor thing, off in exile. It's tragic, Jane, absolutely tragic." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "though perhaps not quite so tragic as it seems. You see, my dear Dolly, people rarely set out to do evil. They simply do not recognize it, when it comes in a form they think justified. Miss Crane believed herself wronged. Mr. Denham believed himself desperate. And Miss Fenton, well, she believed herself clever enough to control the rest. Pride, fear, love, they lead us all down the same winding paths sooner or later." Dolly frowned, pouring herself tea. "You make it sound almost inevitable. Isn't there any hope for people then?" "Though there's always hope," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "But hope is rather like laurel water, I think. Best taken in small doses lest it turn bitter." Dolly laughed, though a little uneasily, and soon changed the subject to lighter matters. But long after her friend had gone, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting untouched, her thoughts far away. The snow deepened outside, muffling every sound, and the world beyond her window seemed almost pure again, cleansed by silence. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Evil did not vanish. It only slept, wearing the polite mask of civility until stirred again by the old human failings, envy, greed, vanity, and the tender, terrible ache of love. When the clock struck 10, she rose and drew the curtains, then paused to look out once more at the village. A single light still glowed from the vicarage. Beyond that, nothing but the soft shimmer of frost and moonlight. Somewhere she knew another story was beginning to take shape. Another whisper in another drawing-room, another harmless lie that might one day bloom into tragedy. Miss Marple smiled faintly, almost fondly. "Well," she murmured to herself, "we shall see what spring brings, shan't we?" She banked the fire, tidied her teacup, and set her knitting aside for the night. Then she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, her steps slow but sure. In the morning, she would wake early, write to Raymond, and perhaps visit the churchyard to place a small wreath on Lady Beatrice's grave. It seemed the proper thing to do, not for the sake of the dead, but for the living. Outside, the snow continued to fall, veiling St. Mary Mead in white, and within that tranquil village, where nothing ever truly stayed secret, and every soul carried its own small mystery, Miss Marple slept, content in the quiet knowledge that for now, the world had been set right again for now.